We're very pleased to have Dr. Michael Orkin here to give us a talk today. And Dr. Michael Orkin has a very distinguished career. He's currently managing scientist at Exponent, a publicly traded scientific consulting company here in Menlo Park. He's a well-known personality. He's been nationally quoted on CNN, NBC's Dateline, and ABC World News. And he's written several books, including What Are the Odds? A Chance in Everyday Life. He's consulted for clients in both government and private sector, including the FBI and Las Vegas odds makers. His software has also been featured in the January 2002 issue of Wired magazine. So here he is today. Let's give a good Google welcome to Mike. And could I please ask that, because this talk is being video recorded, any confidential Google questions should be left till after the cameras have been switched off. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Sadiq. So today, the title of my talk, and I'm happy to be here, is Chance, Data Mining, and Sports Betting, and we'll see what those things have in common. I am currently located at Exponent. If you haven't heard of it, it's sometimes called Exponent Failure Analysis. It's located right on 101 North in Menlo Park. It's a publicly traded company that has about 800 employees in 18 offices and 3 international offices. And consultants at Exponent, a majority of whom are engineers, have expertise in science, math, and engineering. And Exponent has been consulted on various problems and disasters, including some of the major ones you read about in the paper, such as the grounding of the Exxon Valdez, the walkway collapse of the Kansas City Hyatt, the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. By the way, in this talk, just stop me at any time if you have any questions, and we'll have more of a conversational tone. So I'm in what's called the Data and Risk Analysis group, and I'm trained as a statistician and do stuff in probability theory, decision theory, game theory. And our group develops strategies for decision making under uncertainty, and in a variety of contexts. One of the things our group specializes in is determining whether a particular activity or product poses an unreasonable risk, and if so, what to do about it. And many of our projects involve litigation, involving such things as consumer product issues and recalls, automotive lawsuits, and doing risk analyses and failure analyses to try to develop strategies for companies who have products. And I can't really go into too much detail about things that are in litigation right now, but that's not what I want to talk about anyway. I want to talk about one of my specialties, which is chance and gambling games. And I'll actually be talking about a case that is an Exponent case, along with some software and things that are not Exponent things, just things I've done. So first, this is a little primer on gambling. So roulette, how many of you have been to a casino and have seen a roulette wheel? Okay, most of you. So roulette's a pretty simple game to understand. There are 38 sections labeled from 1 to 36, along with a 0 and a double 0. And half of the sections are from 1 to 36 are red, half are black, 0 and double 0 are green. You can bet on a color, you can bet on a combination of numbers. You can make varieties of bets at the roulette table. And one of the bets is number 17. In other words, you put some chips on the number 17. The wheel is spun, the ball is dropped in. 17, the ball lands in the slot marked 17. You win, otherwise you lose. And since there are 38 sections on the wheel, your chance of winning is 1 in 38. If you bet on red, since there are 18 red sections out of 38, your chance of winning is 18 out of 38. So you're much more likely to win a red bet than you are a bet on number 17. So to get people to make this bet, what does the casino have to do? they have to offer higher payoff odds. And so the payoff odds for this bet, a bet on a particular number, are 35 to 1. That means if you bet $1 and number 17 comes up, you'll make a $35 profit. You'll get your dollar chip back plus another 35. Okay? Well, there's a mathematical theorem called the law of averages. It's called the law of large numbers by mathematicians. And it says that if you repeat an experiment independently over and over again, the fraction of times that something comes up will be the same as the probability of it happening in one trial. So the probability of it happening in one trial on this bet is 1 in 38. So you don't know what's going to happen in one bet or two bets or a few bets, but in repeated bets, you'll win an average of 1 in 38 and lose an average of 37 for a net loss of $2. So that's $2 and $38 bet, which becomes 5.3% profit for the house being the casino. So that's called the house edge in roulette. And it's very straightforward, cut and dry math. This is what happens if you repeatedly make a bet in roulette. Like I said, you can get lucky, you can get unlucky and lose sooner than at this rate, or you can win and quit. But in repeated play, you will eventually lose and go broke at roughly the rate of 5.3 cents per dollar bet. Sooner if you have a losing streak. Okay, so that's that's sort of the facts on betting on number 17 in roulette, and in fact on making just about any roulette bet or combination of roulette bets or other betting strategy applied to roulette. Okay? So you can show mathematically that this is what happens, period. For instance, people use some sort of sophisticated strategies like double your money if you lose and keep going until you eventually win. You've heard that one, the double up strategy. So you start out by betting $1, and if you lose, you bet $2, and then if you lose again, you bet $4, and eventually you'll win, thereby covering your losses. Okay? So that's an interesting strategy that people use in various types of investment situations, namely, if you start losing, bet more. And you can show that that's not a good thing to do. And in fact, it's really not a good thing to do in a losing game. And one of the reasons it's not a good thing to do is that the house has a betting limit, and if you have an unlucky sequence of losses, you can't double your bet because they won't let you bet that much. And another problem is that you have a betting limit. If you have an unlucky sequence of losses, you might run out of money before you can double your bet and come out ahead. Anyway, so that's the sort of the quick tour of roulette. Now, if you talk about roulette bettors, you could say a roulette bettor who makes a profit after 10 bets would be lucky. But a long-run profit would be very weird. The math says it's really unlikely to happen. So a possible explanation for somebody who makes a long-run profit in roulette, they're cheating. So they have some scheme worked out, and they're not really playing according to the regular roulette odds. On the other hand, you can also detect if a roulette bettor is losing more than he or she should. In fact, if a roulette bettor is losing after 10 bets, so what? They're unlucky. But if they lose in the long run and repeated bets faster than they should, faster than chance predicts, 5.3 cents per bet, that would also be weird. That would be equally weird as the winner. And then possible explanation for that, the bettor is being cheated. Okay, so there are two different kinds of weird. Weird good and weird bad. Okay, but anyway, where do you draw the line between luck and something else is going on? So statisticians, that's sort of the basic question of statistical inference. Traditionally, 5% is a cutoff point, which is called statistically significant. If what you observe has less than a 5% chance of happening under ordinary circumstances, you conclude that something else is going on. So in roulette, it's simple. You can make probability calculations and answer this statistical question. Is what you've seen weird, or is it just within the bounds of chance? Okay, what about betting on football games? What's the chance that the 49ers will win next week? Well, 49ers started out looking pretty good in their first couple of games, but what's going to happen next week? Well, football is not like roulette. The same experiment is not repeated under identical independent conditions, and so the law of averages and various probability models don't necessarily apply. So you can't make these cut and dried mathematical statements about the persistent football bettor goes broke, which you can say about roulette or craps or keno or any of the casino games of pure chance. Okay, well, football betting is an interesting industry. It's about a $10 billion industry right now, almost entirely illegal. And
Illegal industries such as this measured? What is illegal? How is 10 billion come up?
Surveys there are trade organizations that do surveys and find out. In fact, I'll give you a link in a minute. It's a good question. But they're illegal. Here's one answer. They're illegal. Football betting is legal in this country except in Nevada. Okay? Football betting is legal just about everywhere else in the world. So internet gambling is very popular. And internet gambling is legal except here. So that's sort of an interesting legal issue, as you probably know, because if you bet on a football game here, you're violating some federal law, but you're playing in an online casino that's perfectly legal, that's located in Costa Rica or Jamaica or Canada. So legal is sort of a strange term in this world. But yeah, how do you come up with a number like that? So there are trade organizations that do surveys and find out things like that. Okay, so a typical football bet, not all, but typical football bet is done with a point spread. So a point spread is a handicap given to the inferior team. And who decides that it's an inferior team? Well, in some sense, the bettors decide. So here's how it works. I'm going to go to the third bullet point. First week of the season, the 49ers played Arizona, and the Niners were 9-point underdogs. So that means if you bet on the Niners in that first week, you get 9 free points tacked onto their score. So it turns out San Francisco lost that first game, 34-27. But if you add 9 points, the Niners win. So people who bet on the 49ers in that first game won their bets. And the people who bet on Arizona, even though Arizona won the game, lost. So that's fine. Now, the casino has to make a profit, so they pay 10 to 11 odds. So that means if you make an $11 bet with a point spread and you win, you make a $10 profit. Okay. So now, why does that mean? How does that ensure that the casino is going to make some money? Well, what the odds makers want to do is get the same amount of money to be bet on each team in a game. And if that happens, because of the 10 to the 11 odds, the losers pay off the winners, and there's a little bit of money left over for the casino. So if there are 2 bettors on a game and each bet's $11, that's $22 bet, and one wins, the other loses. So the 10 is paid off out of the 11, that's $1 left for the casino. 1 out of 22 is 4.5%. So if the casino gets an even split of the money on a game, then they make a 4.5% profit on that game. It doesn't matter which team wins. So that's what they want to do. Now, if one team has an 80% chance of winning and the other team has a 20% chance of winning, whatever that means, but everybody likes the 20% team, then the point spread is going to be shifted so to get more money bet on the team that really should be the one that everybody's betting on. So if the betting public is foolish, the point spread may give a statistical advantage to the smart bettor who knows that they're betting on the money's coming in on the wrong team. So that's different from roulette. On the other hand, if the betting public it's different from roulette in the sense that it's sort of like the stock market. The odds are determined by the public, and if the public doesn't know what they're doing, the bettor who does know what he or she's doing can take advantage of that situation. On the other hand, if the betting public is smart, equalizing the betting action will also equalize each team's chance of winning, and the game will be equivalent to a coin toss. Okay, so you don't want to get 10 to 11 odds for betting on a coin toss. So in order to win in the long run, you have to find situations in which the betting public isn't smart. In other words, in which your chance of winning is greater than 50%. So it turns out that if you just look at some basic situations, like how often does the home team win? Well, if you look at the years 1993 to the present, the home team actually wins the game almost 60% of the time. But when you factor in the point spread, it's almost a 50-50 split. So if you just think, I'm just going to bet on the home team because I know they win 60% of the time, you're going to lose. Because the point spread completely equalizes that. Okay, so what do people do? Well, in one form or another, a lot of sports bettors do data mining. Of course, some of them don't actually use software. They just pour through data by hand. But nowadays, there are a lot of sophisticated sports bettors who actually use software. And so, in general, data mining software is used to find predictive patterns in large data sets. So people use data mining for all kinds of things, investment strategies, web surfing patterns, just to try to find patterns. And I wrote some software to search football data that sort of points out some of the issues of data mining. And I was actually motivated by badgering from some attorney friends who were avid sports bettors and didn't like doing all this stuff by hand. And they thought it would be great to automate the process of trying to find good betting situations. Okay, so I did that a couple years ago. And it basically uses SQL to query a football database. It has a user-friendly interface necessary for lawyers. There's a procedure in the software that automatically generates queries, so it does random queries, and it finds good results and saves them in a separate file and just forgets about bad results, where good means better than coin tossing. And so it uncovers trends, or possibly it uncovers trends that the user wouldn't think of. There's no best strategy when you look for patterns like this, but instead you try to collect a bunch of good strategies, such as. Now it turns out that by data mining from 2000 to 2006, the Baltimore Ravens were 17-3 versus the point spread. That's an 85% success record when they lost their previous game and their opponents played their previous game on the road. So the question, of course, is, for any thoughtful data miner, is this really meaningful, or is it just a random coincidence that you found by data mining? So first of all, you have to define what a good strategy is. Win percentage doesn't work because 1 and 0 is 100%, and that's, of course, meaningless. 17-3 is only 85%. So as I mentioned a minute ago, one way to define good or weird or out of the ordinary is to compare the strategy to an appropriate probability distribution, in this case, coin tossing. So you see if the strategy does a lot better than coin tossing. And it turns out that 7-3 record of the Ravens, if that's really coin tossing, in other words, if it's just a random fluke, the chance of getting something like that is about 1 in 1,000. So just use the binomial distribution. For those of you who know basic probability distributions, the chance of getting 17-3 or better out of 20 is about 1 in 1,000. So a statistician would reject the null hypothesis, which means you would say that's not just chance. So in other words, that would be considered in some context a good strategy. So the question is, should you bet on Baltimore in this situation? Okay, well, interestingly enough, technology changes the meaning of unlikely in contexts, in situations like this. And there's something called the law of very large numbers, which says given enough opportunity, weird things happen just due to chance. So when you're mining through data, doing lots of queries, saving the good ones. By good, I mean good compared to coin tossing, discarding the bad ones. The meaning of 1 in 1,000 sort of changes a little bit. So in fact, using a modest PC, this particular data mining software does about 1,000 queries a minute when it's doing the automated query thing. It's generating queries at random, analyzing them to see if they're better than coin tossing, saving them in a file if they are. Anyway, that's lots of opportunity for weird things to happen just due to chance. So even if you generate this data by tossing coins, you'll find the 17 and 3 result about once a minute. And you can turn this on and let it run all night, so you can find all kinds of great stuff. Okay, so statisticians consider something statistically significant if the chance of occurring is less than 1 in 20 under a suitable hypothesis. In the data mining environment, even 1 in 1,000 doesn't necessarily mean rule out chance. So more generally, these kinds of techniques in which you're doing repeated queries and analyzing them sort of comes under the general heading of multiple comparisons. You're testing lots of statistical hypotheses at once, and what happens is you might find some useful things, you might find some strategies in which you'll win money, but a lot of the stuff you're going to find is just random stuff. So that's one of the issues that's one of the big issues when you're doing things like data mining of this type that you have to deal with. And of course, there are some standard procedures for dealing with that. The main remedy is you apply your strategy that you've developed by looking at some data to a fresh set of data and see how it works there. So statisticians would call it, or decision theorists, you'd have a training sample and then a new data set that you'd apply your thing to. And so then if it's just due to chance from mining the training set, it won't work on the new data. Or you can do a simulation, do a lot of random queries and compare your results to a probability model. So for example, if you're doing a lot of random queries on this football data and you're comparing, you draw a graph of the results, you should see a record of 17 and 3 occurring with a frequency of about 1 in 1,000 if it's just due to chance. If you get some weird pattern in your histogram or whatever graph you're looking at, then maybe there's something other than coin tossing going on. Any questions so far?
Well, it seems like you could also just bet on all of these flukes. And the ones which are useless are going to be 50-50 for you. This is a small amount that you can see this edge. And the ones which are actually useful will win you money. That's
exactly what lots of people do, except for the part about winning money. It turns out that the 10 to 11 odds are a little bit deceptive, and you have to win more than 52.4% of the time in order to make a profit because of that. And but that is a standard strategy. People they either by hand or using software find lots of these types of situations that look like they give you an edge, and they'll just bet on them, and they'll even rate them, like this one's really good, and so they'll bet more on the one that's really good than the one that's just sort of good, and I think some people are modestly successful doing things like that. Any other questions? Okay, let's see. An earlier version of the software was featured in Wired magazine in 2002 in the street cred section, but let's actually look at the software for a sec. If I can get it up here. So this is it's called the optimizer. And so let's say you want to see how the home team does so it has this sort of user-friendly interface, 2001 to 2006. In the month of September, can you see that? I guess you can sort of see it. You get the statistics, and you can see that the home team from 2001 to the present, not including last week's games. So SU means straight up. They're 144 and 110. They won about close to 57% of their games. But versus the point spread, they're almost 50-50 at home. This is just the home team. And this z-value is that's the measure of how far away from coin tossing it is. A large z-value means very unlikely under coin tossing. There's another kind of bet in football called the over-under, where you try to guess what the total score, where you bet on what the total score, whether the total score will be over or under a particular number. So the software keeps track of that too. Okay, so if I wanted to look at a particular team, let's look at Atlanta. How do they do in September? Okay, so Atlanta's 5-3 on the road, 4-4 at home versus the spread in September, and so on. Suppose I wanted to see which team had the best September record, looking at all records of this type. I just click Optimize, and I see that Jacksonville is actually 12-4 versus the spread in September, which gives them so that's another one of these good records. And so you can also look at what happened in the last game, won or loss. So let's look at games where, let's see, go back to take that off. The home team, just playing around here, won their last game and played at home in their last game. How did they do? And so pretty much 50-50 against the spread. So this is basically just a statement of the query up here. Okay, and then you can also look at a list of the games for that query. So it's just a query output. And then this part here gives you certain accesses the file that stores good situations. Okay, so now the automated part, let's say you want to, so I'm going to clear this. Let's say you want to look at I'm going to restrict the year range, 2000 to 2006. Let's see if we can find any good strategies for, I don't know, the Niners. So I'm just going to click random search. So it's looking for good strategies for the 49ers, and that search count tells how many queries it's looked at and analyzed. And it's only saving the ones with z values greater than 2.5. And so far it hasn't found anything. Oops, there it found one. Okay, I'll let it run for another couple seconds. 2. So it's found 2 strategies. Let's just look at the best one. So, and this is a strategy. The 49ers from 2000 to the present, when their opponent's last game was on the road, and the opponent's last game was under, that means not a lot of points were scored, then the 49ers on the road are 2-13 versus the spread with 2 ties. That's a z-value of 2.84. So what that suggests is when this situation comes up, you bet against the Niners because they're 2-13. Okay, and then here's a list of all those 49er games. And then, as I said, you can look at the saved situations in there. Another thing you can do with the software is you can get updates from the web. So if you click on that, it will actually automatically download the scores of this week and point spreads for this week. And you can manage this situations. That means the good strategies you've already found. You can share it with other people. You can import last year's, and so on. You can also print out any of this stuff. So I don't have many saved situations, but if I wanted to look at all the games in September, I can go for each one, and so I don't think anything's on here, but let's see, I'll just look real quickly. All right, so if you have some people who use this software have thousands of situations, it'll find the ones that apply to a particular game. So anyway, so the part about this software that's that I think sort of interesting is the random search thing, and that is just an automated query generator. Okay, so any questions? Yeah.
Is it interesting to do things like genetic algorithms instead of just randomly generating?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and in fact, we were messing with that for a while. So a genetic algorithm would be sort of taking a good strategy, looking at the parameters of a good strategy, like won or lost. So let's say that Baltimore strategy, they won when they lost the last week and their opponent was whatever. So you have a bunch of variables in some vector, and a genetic algorithm would do something like perturb the different values in the components of the vector and see if you can get something better. So it would sort of try to genetically mutate the vector, which defines your strategy, and get a better one out of it. And so, we sort of messed around with that. It's not part of the software right now. Yeah.
You potentially use this software to identify which features, which aspects of the data the bookmakers themselves are using to come up with the point spread, and more importantly, which ones they're ignoring.
Well, actually, that's a good question. The answer is the way the bookmakers come up with the point spread is they look at the amount of money that's being bet on each team. And if it's not equally balanced, they'll make the point spread more favorable for the team that's not being bet on. They're not really looking at much of anything except the betting money, and that's all automated. Now, they have to start with something. So at the beginning of the week, like right now, in fact, on my way in, let's see if I've got this. In the lobby, I stole the sports section of today's Mercury News, and even though football betting is illegal, sitting right here in the lobby is the Mercury News latest line, pro football. So I can see that this coming week, Philadelphia is a 6-point favorite over the 49ers. Buffalo is a 5.5-point favorite over the Jets, and so on. And then they also have the lines for college football. And if it's bad to bet on pro football, it's supposed to be a real sin to bet on college football because you're sort of corrupting the integrity of the game. But here it is in the San Jose Mercury News. I don't know. What? That's the Nevada issue, right? This is the online issue.
So how does it work if the point spread changes over the week?
Okay, so right, so that's a good question. So he had asked, so your question was, how does the odds makers decide what are the important factors? Well, they start out with something, because here it is Monday, and they've already printed the line, which is roughly resembling the various lines in Las Vegas. And so there hasn't been that much betting action yet. So they had to start with something. And so what they start with is they look at software and they look at the records of teams, and they have formulas that give what are called power ratings, which are just ratings of how good teams are. And then they just sort of sit around and actually just sort of talk about how they think the public is going to bet. And then they'll come out with what's called an opening line. And they'll modify the opening line throughout the week. And it doesn't change by that much, actually. They're pretty good at coming out with the opening line. So the things that and they know a lot about football and whatever sport they're handicapping. In fact, the companies in Las Vegas that handicap sports have experts in each sport who really know a lot about the sport. And they also have software. And so, but the software is software that just gives trends and patterns, not exactly data mining software, but they use that too. But they rely heavily on how they think the public is going to bet. So if you place a bet, so right now, the 49ers, I didn't answer your question. Right now, if you bet on Philadelphia, you have to give 6 points. Philadelphia is playing the 49ers next week, and they're a 6-point favorite. So let's say that during the week, lots of people bet on Philadelphia, and so they move the point spread up to 7, okay? When you made your bet, it was 6, so you get 6. That was your question, right? Yeah. So you get the point spread that was available when you made your bet. Yeah.
So you're essentially trying to estimate the probability of winning from the past games. So is there an assumption that probability estimates that you learned from the past are going to be valid in the future as well?
Well, if you're doing this data mining method or something similar to it, that's correct.
How reasonable is that assumption?
That assumption is only moderately reasonable for a few important reasons. One is that teams change, coaches change, stadiums change, And so it's not like the roulette environment. You get these new situations. Like this year, the Raiders have a new coach, a new offensive coordinator. Offensive is a good word for him. And they have a new quarterback, and so it's like a...
So how sound could that bet be based on all these numbers going on?
Okay, so that's... So what people who bet on sports do is they get these patterns, they get these things like Baltimore Ravens are 17-3, let's bet on them this week. And then they look at other things that might be more connected with the real world, namely, and they do what a statistician would do. They would say, okay, I have this weird situation now, what's a plausible explanation? And if there's no plausible explanation, a smart person would say, this is just random nonsense.
So why not weight things differently? So the further they are in the past, the events get lower weight. Can you try that?
People have used other techniques. What people tend to do, use software like this, or is to restrict the year range. And so I know some people who say if you go back more than 2 years, you're an idiot, because everything that's relevant has happened within the last 2 years. That's almost like Markov chains or something. But then I know this guy who's a sports bettor who says you have to go back at least 15 years, because only then can you get enough data to establish a pattern, and that there are certain underlying physical characteristics and dynamics of football that you can uncover by looking at lots of years. So there's mixed opinion on that. Yeah.
How much of a factor does the score quantization play in this? Only some combinations of scores are likely because of the way that the points are gained during the game. If you did this...
Oh yeah, okay, so that's actually an important issue for a couple of score things. Like a point spread, like 17% of games land on a 3-point difference. So if you're a bookmaker and you change the point spread from 3 to 3.5, you're doing a huge thing. Whereas if you change the point spread from 1 to 1.5, it doesn't mean very much. So in order to move the point spread off of 3, then there has to be a huge imbalance in the betting. So there are certain score differences that happen, like 7 is the other number, but 3 is the big number. So, and then in fact you can even buy a half a point at some casinos. So instead of getting 10 to 11 odds, you'll get, or 11 to 10, however you want to say it, you'll get 6 to 5 odds, which is worse. And they'll move the point spread a point just for your bet, half a point just for your bet. So yes, so that the attention is mainly from the bookmakers, who are much more hesitant to move off of a popular actual difference in score, or a frequent one like 3, and then also the bettors. For instance, 3.5 point. If the point spread's 3.5, then a lot of the so-called wise guys, who are the professional gamblers, will take the underdog because they know that a lot of games will end on 3. So they'll take the 3.5 points, knowing that they'll win a 3-point game, a 3-point loss. So that brings up another little dynamic of sports betting, and that is there are basically 2 camps of bettors who the bookmakers call the squares and the wise guys. And it sounds kind of funny, and it is. And the wise guys are the professional bettors, and the squares are like, you go to Las Vegas for the weekend and you bet on the home team. But they actually use that. They will not move the point. If some wealthy square comes in and makes a huge bet on a team, they're not going to move the point spread in the same manner that they would if a well-known gambler comes in and makes the same bet. And so there are some well-known gamblers, this is a little bit of football betting lore or sports betting lore, well-known gamblers who actually hire people to go make bets for them because they don't want to have an effect on the odds. And the gamblers who go bet on them are called beards.
It sounds like there's a whole population of people who are professional bettors out there. I don't know anything about this, but if you analyze whether there's any real consistence in performance and people that are experts.
Okay, so your question, I think, is do the wise guys do better than the squares?
Well, not only that, but are there people who are so good that they make a lot of money from it? And it's not just chance.
Well, let's put it this way. There are people who are so good that they make a lot of money from the sports betting industry. Now, I know a couple of these people, and I know that they make a lot of money by selling information. Whether they actually make any money by betting on games is an open question. But they will have tout services. In other words, they'll sell. Like there's a publication called the Gold Sheet that comes out of Los Angeles, which you can buy at any newsstand. Costs, I think, $7 now or something. It comes out every week. They do football and basketball, and so the guy who originally founded it was an avid sports bettor, and he passed away now, but I used to know the guy, and I don't know if he ever made anything actually betting, but he had 35,000 subscribers to this weekly little sheet, and plus lots of people who buy it off the newsstand. So he made a lot of money in the sports betting industry. And so typical gamblers, but there are some people who seem to make money at it. I don't know how much. Anything else?
How the strategies that have been output by your software actually perform in predicting games?
Some of them have performed well. Actually, there are a few. I don't really market it anymore because I'm too busy doing other things. But it's available on a website, and there are some people who we have a group of users who swear that the strategies work. And that they made lots of money. And I personally haven't really been doing much betting. I'm more the developer, not the gambler.
I was wondering, I don't know too much about sports betting in the US, but back where I come from, the different institutions have quite reasonably different odds spreads, I guess, that they're offering. Is that the case here, or typically do they all stay the same?
Typically in football, they all stay pretty much the same, because as soon as one changes a little bit, people will go and bet on what they think is the right team, and they'll force them to comply. So it's just the betting public is so versatile. They will, especially because of computer technology and stuff like that, they won't let odds be much different from one casino to another, because you can do things like hedge. You can hedge if there are different odds, and so you can make bets on each team in different places if you have different point spreads. So hedging is not easy in pro football betting, because everything, especially with online gambling, there's just so much of it going on that everything is within a half a point usually. So you can say it's the point spread plus or minus half a point just about everywhere by the end of the week. But now, during the week, if an injury occurs or something happens, then of course the point spread might move a lot. Any other? It's okay. I'm going to go to something else now that still has to do with sports betting. So let's see. Okay, so this is the website. If you're interested, you can download a free 10-day copy. If you send me an email, I'll send you an authorization key to use it. But you can use it for 10 days for free anyway. It's snoopdata.com of this software. Okay, I want to talk about another little. We have a few minutes. I'm going to talk a few minutes about an actual case that I got involved in as an expert. So I want to talk a little about internet gambling. So, and I'm going to answer your question in a minute. Internet gambling is about a $12 billion industry. Actually, it's more than that. It's more like a $20 billion industry now. Illegal in the U.S. except for horse racing. So I'm not just talking about sports betting. Internet gambling is illegal in this country, technically, except for horse racing. Now, what does that mean? I'm sure a lot of you have seen websites like Party Poker, where you can play poker online. If you play on Party Poker in the state of Washington, you are guilty of a felony right now. You're not going to get arrested, but there's a new law in the state of Washington that makes internet poker playing a felony. So it's a very weird situation. Now notice I say except for horse racing. So that's interesting. And in fact, there's a law that's sort of moving its way through Congress right now, in which the people supporting the bill are making these impassioned speeches on the floor of Congress about how internet gambling is destroying our moral culture and ruining the lives of compulsive gamblers, and it has to be outlawed, except horse racing. And horse racing, of course, betting on horses is legal in California and in various states. And so they sort of have a lot of lobbying pressure. And so horse racing, for some reason, is above the fray here and isn't immoral. And you can bet on horse racing on the internet, and it's perfectly okay. So right now, except for horse racing, there are over 2,000 internet casinos, and they're all offshore, except for the horse racing websites. There are about 23 million internet gamblers in 2005, 8 million from the U.S. And in April of 2005, the World Trade Organization ruled that the U.S. Is violating certain rules because they don't treat foreign and domestic internet gambling businesses equally, in the sense that everything's illegal except horse racing. And so far, nothing has happened. However, recently, the federal government has arrested and thrown in jail 2 people who own large internet, who are CEOs of internet gambling websites offshore. One guy from England who is the CEO of a company that's a well-established website, completely legal in England. In fact, is traded on. It's a publicly traded company on the London Stock Exchange. He was going to Jamaica, and he had to stop over in Dallas, and the feds busted him in Dallas and threw him in jail, where he still sits a couple months later. And it's not quite clear. He's charged with violating U.S. wire laws. But still, they're not going after. No one's going after individual bettors at this point. Okay, so there are some articles that talk about these things. So here's an article from the Louisville, Kentucky Courier-Journal, which talks about how horse racing is good. Here's an article about that poker law from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which talks about how poker is bad. And then here's one of these trade organizations, the American Gaming Association. So if you Google the American Gaming Association, you might find this article. I can email you a copy of this if you want, if you're interested in where these stats come from that I'm putting on some of these slides. They're one of the organizations that gathers data on that industry. Okay. All right, so here's a story. There was a businessman a few years ago, about 5 years ago, and he raised $40 million in investments for a company that was supposed to be on the verge of obtaining a patent for a lucrative new tooth whitening product. Okay, raised $40 million. Okay, there was such a product, but this guy had no connection to it. He was a swindler. In fact, he had seen about this product. He had seen this product advertised on the shopping network, and so he started raising money for it, claiming he had a patent and that he was going to sell it to Procter & Gamble. Okay. Well, he spent $10 million of this $40 million to buy homes, condos, nice cars, and he gambled away all the rest of it, $30 million, betting on baseball at an offshore casino. Okay, so he went completely broke. The investors started asking for their money, or for their, he promised them, 100 to 1 return on their investment, and he didn't have any. So he got busted. He declared bankruptcy. He was sent to prison. So the victims of the swindle retained a law firm that specializes in recovering funds from bankruptcy cases. So they got the homes and the cars seized and got money back from that. They got a few $1 million back from that, enough to pay the attorney fees, basically. And then they filed a lawsuit against the casino. And they said a bunch of things. One, they said the casino wasn't doing its due diligence. They should have known this guy was a swindler. This was all done online and by telephone. They said they should have, with this kind of money and stuff, they should have checked up. Well, in fact, the guy was betting directly by wires from the Bank of Montreal that were sent into the offshore account. So the Bank of Montreal was equally culpable. So they sort of gave up on the due diligence argument. So then they alleged in this lawsuit that the online casino has to return the money because that the casino was either cheating the swindler or the casino was involved with the swindler in a money laundering scheme. In other words, the swindler wasn't really losing this money. He was just feeding it to this offshore account, and he was going to later split it with the guy who ran the casino. Okay. All right, well, the guy who ran the casino had pretty good records, and he could show that he was keeping that money for himself and wasn't going to share it with anybody. Especially some guy who just got out of jail and was working at a gas station. So they decided to focus on this. If the casino had given the swindler proper betting odds, he couldn't possibly have lost $30 million over a 2-year period. In other words, the result couldn't have been due to chance. Sort of what I was talking about before with good strategies. In other words, the swindler's losses were just too extreme to be explained by chance. Okay, well, the swindler was betting on baseball games. He was betting an average of 10 games a day, $15K a game. And when the baseball season wasn't on, he was betting on hockey. Okay, so if you translate that, $15,000 a day, $15,000 a bet, 10 bets a day over 2 years, you get about $110 million in betting action, which is called churn. Okay, so that's how much betting action we have from this guy before he finally got busted. He didn't go broke, he just got busted. He got arrested. I guess he was pretty much broke at the time. So the question is, how much on average will a gambler lose when he bets $110 million in relatively small increments over time? And of course the answer is, it depends. It depends on the bets. In particular, it depends on the house edge, which is sometimes called the hold percentage in sports betting. So with roulette, the house edge is 5.3%. So if a gambler makes roulette bets with a house edge of 5.3% at that rate, 10 bets a day, 15,000 a bet, you'd lose an average of about $6 million. In fact, if you can also compute a probability here for roulette, the chance of losing 30 million or more making those kinds of bets is less than 1 in 1,000. So it's really unlikely that if this guy was playing roulette, he would lose that kind of money. Well, as we've seen, sports betting is different from roulette, but still you can talk about the hold percentage. Well, in baseball betting, just real quickly, there's something different than a point spread. It's called a money line, and money line is just another way of stating payoff odds. And so the favorite has a negative money line, which means you have to bet more to win a certain amount. And the underdog has a positive money line, so it's all in units of 100. So anyway, you can take these money lines, and what they do is they shade one of the money lines so that there's a slight imbalance, so it isn't a fair bet. That is, if you bet on both teams, you break even. And so when they do that, and what they'll do is they'll take 20 points off the underdog line, starting with some number that they think is good for dividing the betting action again. The bookmaker makes a certain profit. And in fact, for a typical baseball bet, the profit, the hold percentage will be in the neighborhood of 4%, similar to point spread bets. So baseball, just betting on a team in baseball, yields about the same profit margin for casinos per dollar bet. Okay? It's not, and it depends very much on how much money is bet on each team in a game. But anyway, so typically that's what bookmakers make, though, on baseball betting, somewhere around 4%. Okay, well, if you do that, if the swindler had been making random bets with a 4%, 3.8% house edge for that whole run of 110 million, he would have lost about 4 million. If he actually was using any skill in baseball betting, he might have even done better. He might have lost less than 4 million. Because you can have skill and still lose money, of course. If you can have skill and just do worse than randomness, and because of the odds, you can still go broke. So you can be skillfully bankrupt. But in any event, this guy lost 30 million. So the question is, was he being cheated? Well, it turns out there's another kind of baseball bet called a parlay bet. And some of you may know what a parlay bet is. Parlay bet just means you bet on a bunch of different events, and they all have to happen for you to win. So, for example, here's a 4-team, and you can do that in any sport. Here's a 4-team parlay. You bet that San Francisco beats Florida, Pittsburgh beats Milwaukee, Oakland beats Kansas City, and the Yankees beat Boston. Okay, if you make that bet, all those teams have to win in order for you to win your bet. Otherwise, you lose. So the payoff odds are somewhat high. They're huge payoff odds. In fact, you get the payoff odds by multiplying the probabilities together for winning for each of those teams, roughly speaking, taking a little bit off for the bookmaker profit. So it turns out that these types of bets are highly profitable if you win, but on the other hand, there's a huge house edge or hold percentage because the casinos don't want to expose themselves to the risk of taking huge parlay bets because of the big payoff odds. So they'll make the odds such that they're not so good for the bettor. Okay, so a typical 4-team parlay bet, the house edge is between 25 and 30%. Okay, the same is true if you make if you look at games with high payoff odds, the house edge is always worth, like the state lottery, for instance. The house edge equivalent is 50%. The state keeps 50% of all the money bet. Keno is another game. If you've seen the game of Keno in a casino, that's a type of lottery. Keno bets typically have a 20 to 30% house edge because you can win a whole lot of money for a $1 bet. So on games like that have very high payoffs with very low chance of winning, the house edge is typically high. So these 4-team parlay bets, 4 or 5, this guy was betting 4 or 5 and 6-team parlay bets generally. He was exposing the casino to, he was betting large, 15,000 a bet, these 4-team, 5-team, 6-team parlay bets. So any win, he would get like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so the casinos, the online casino was hesitant to take the money on such large bets. They don't usually, so they spread it out around other casinos, and so the money trail gets sort of dispersed. And anyway, let's just look at the bottom line. Let's say the house edge is about 27.5%, and that's what this guy was doing. He was making these parlay bets. In the $110 million bet, you multiply by 27.5%, you get $30 million. And that's exactly what the guy lost. So I'm going to stop with that, sort of run out of time, but I will answer questions. Anybody? Okay, if anybody wants any other information, just come on up and get it. Thank you very much.